So the question is, why are you in this audit committee meeting? Are you in a position to make decisions? And do you have what you will need to make a decision? See, I told you I'll catch on this audit stuff. Okay.
There was,
last batch
there was another question where they asked
about
when
addressing something with,
the chairman meets the company secretary, when the incoming chairman meets the company secretary.
all right.
There was that question.
All
The response to that question, what we often do is we do the induction. We go through the induction for, as the director of the company, you tick that, the duties of the director, and then you come to the audit committee and the chairman. And often most companies, they don't select a chairman who's not been a member of the audit committee, because then as Cindy talked about the efficiencies, you want continuity and consistency in your audit committee. However, the company secretary would then meet the chairman and go through the terms of reference, you go through the work plan, you go through the agenda, you go through the process when the chairman approves the minutes of the meeting, when the chairman approves the agenda, when the papers are submitted. So you go through that induction process with the chairman of the audit committee, as you do with the chairman of any committee of the board.
Just,
All right.
a comment from my side. I think, as Sathi noted, I think as a chairman, be it an audit committee or board, you rely on your company secretary a lot. They're basically your right-hand man in that meeting. So an effective company secretary helps you be more effective. You have to have that working relationship. You know, from being an audit committee member or board member, it's normally a nice to have, but you must know what your role is, what your duties are, what your responsibilities are, what your liabilities are as well. I think that's important. So, you know, when you come in, be it at an audit committee level or board level, you have to be familiar with the company's operating environment, understand their structure, the internal workings, what risks are facing, what challenges. You're never going to come into a perfect environment. So you need to be aware, you need to upskill yourself. You know, read Cindy's book. It sounds like I'm punting it, but read it. It'll give you those key insights saying, even if I come into an imperfect environment, what do I need to have as a minimum? Once I got that minimum base established, how do I move forward to really become effective, really understand what my role is and deliver? So, I mean, if I was incoming, I would meet with the company secretary, understand what documents must look like, from simple things, what your agenda is. Are your charters approved? Are your members familiar with the responsibilities? You know, do you have all accountants, or is it all lawyers, or what's your appropriate mix and spread? And I mean, we can talk a lot more of this over lunch, but I think your company secretary plays a pivotal role. They're basically, you know, the ace in the chairman's pocket.
Right. Mohadi?
Yeah, thank you very much, Program Director. The company secretary also, actually every agenda that you see for the board, for any committee, they are intricately involved in setting that up. And the effectiveness of any committee or board comes from how the agenda is set up. Like the chairman has said, depending on where you are on the organizational cycle of maturity, like for instance, I was on the audit committee for 7 years, that moved from a very large cap to a very small cap. So one thing that was critical was for us to do benchmarks and say, do we have the right mix of skills? Are we having the right policy that's addressing this kind of cap? What has changed? We actually changed our committee and our board 75% to be relevant.
All right. But Tobeka, do they take you seriously enough, the company secretaries, the CEOs?
You mean in the simulated, yes, they
No,
did.
no, not in a simulated, in the real world. Do you feel like a nag, or do you feel like you're a valued member of the team?
I think you always have to find a balance, to be very honest, because when you talk about best practice and good governance, and you have to instill that, there's a level of behavior that you expect to have from your members. So you hope that you find members of your board or the audit committee that are quite versed with their duties and responsibilities. I always carry a stick with myself. I always say to them, do you know what are the liabilities of yourself when you serve in any board of any company? Right. You actually need me more than I need you. Yeah. So you quickly shift that, and when you shift that, it becomes easier, because then they place reliance on you. then you have to be a very competent and experienced company secretary,
Right.
because then they're relying on you to make sure that they're being protected. And I wish to quote my chairman, Mr. Simon, always says to me, Tabaka, you know what, if we get into trouble, you are more in trouble than we are, because you need to make sure that we are out of trouble. And that's the role of the company secretary. It reflects how important and how vital that role is in any organization.
All right. But is it necessary to have people who, because I see legal and financial people on audit committees, is there a gap there with regard to somebody who understands the operation, or you rely on the invitee called the CEO, who sometimes shows up?
When you look at what is the responsibility of a committee, you need to assess what skills does that committee require in order to fulfill its responsibility.
Right.
So you've got to have a variety of people in case, because the financial impact of your legal risks, you need a lawyer to tell you what are those risks. You also need an accountant to actually do a financial ratio analysis and tell you whether you are making money or you'll be making money. What are your forecasts? So you need a variety of skills.
That's the part I can't argue with. But I'm saying, if you are selling toys, I didn't hear anybody who knows about toys, toys business, yeah?
Yes, it is a toy.
How then do you know that the accountant is not spinning a lot of, because accountants can be creative too. Eh?
Okay. Program Director, may I respond to
Please.
that? All right.
Hey, very creative, these bean counters. eh?
Yeah, we don't have to be technical experts in the business to understand the business. It's business acumen. For instance, I was on the board of the media company.
Right.
I made it my business to understand the value chain of the media company. I walked into the printers at midnight. I walked and understood what they're doing. I stood by the street and walked with the newspaper. Then I got an induction for all the board members to do the same.
Right.
Same with revenue services, may I say. We went to the large business, we went to the Ruodeport, Soweto, and understand how tax is collected.
Okay.
So that when we get the pretty PowerPoints, we can ask the stupid questions
Right.
and challenge the audio and the video.
I see. All right. I just thought the CEO might come in and say, no, you don't understand our business. It doesn't really work like that. And oh, sorry, no, he knows the business, I don't. So you went to the tax dodgers as well. You hung out with the tax evaders and asked them how they do it. Okay. Let's take the other questions, please. The last batch of questions. There was a question back there. Can I do the queuing theory right here and get it? Just make sure. She's going to feel so oppressed. She's at the back. She might feel really pushed to the... Please take the mic, but I've spotted 2 hands on this side. I'll definitely come back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It's Nokawe Makiwane from a company called Mfolozi Group Holdings in the Eastern Cape. What I would like to know, Mr. Chairman, to the team
The
there
chairman.
is what are the possibilities of having an outsourced company secretary role? Supposing, for instance, you are a small company and you probably are challenged, like I think I am, to find skills in the area that can be able to fit the role of a company secretary. Is it a role that can be outsourced and still be as effective as it's supposed to be?
So
Thank
they
you,
go
Mr.
for hire, for example. Do you do that?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Mr. Program Director.
Yeah. No, I wanted to answer because it's a direct question. Do you have company secretaries who are freelancing for a couple of companies?
Yes, you do have companies that provide the company secretarial work. Very important, you must understand the difference between a company secretary that provides company secretarial work for the company and is in the company, and an outsourced company secretarial work, because the danger in the outsourcing, you need to clarify where does that role start and where that role stops, because you could find that there could be quite a few bottlenecks and the gaps, but if you clarify that role, yes, you can. Unfortunately, for listed entities, you have to appoint a company secretary.
All right. Thank you very much. At the back, there's a lady there as well, before we move to the right.
Thank you, Program Director. My name is Pumzile. Thank you for the nice audit committee that you compiled, and it's raised a lot of debates with the CFO of the company organization that I work for.
Okay.
One of the questions that we argued about is that who should fulfill the responsibility of a company secretary in a municipality? And the second question was regarding the risk officer, who she reports to, because we don't have a risk officer in our organization, and he feels that I should fulfill those duties as an internal auditor. And another question was regarding the Whistleblowers Act. And as you see, have seen in the audit committee that is in front of us, it was the act, the policy was tabled by the company secretary, and he feels as if those duties should be fulfilled by the internal auditor. I'll request that you give clarity on those issues.
I
Thank you.
missed the second question, Pumzile.
The Whistleblowers Act.
No,
that's
before the
a
whistleblower.
policy that was tabled by the company secretary.
Okay.
And
Did everybody
who
get
should
the
res-
3 questions? If she asks 3 questions, I'm going to ask you to answer them because I won't remember. I won't be able to audit your answers. All right. Now they are consulting, they're having a pre-meeting in committee before they answer. Okay.
Yeah, Chief Risk.
Mahendran, we come to you, we look to you, sir.
I mean, we will leave the company secretary question and the policies to the company secretary. But I think the chief risk officer, who they should report to, it depends on the institution and the size. Some organizations, it's the CEO, because it's at that high level where you want it. Some organizations, the board might request you to report directly to the board chairperson. I think in each organization, you need to find out where exactly does this role fit and what's the level of accountability. In some public sector institutions, they have reported to the chief executive officer if they have one, or the chief accounting officer, or the accounting officer in a department, for instance, because it's at that high level, and risk is a big thing in the public sector. I personally do believe it should report to the CEO or the accounting officer, because at that level you take ultimate responsibility for almost everything in the business, whether it's finance, whether it's operations, and the risk is intricately linked to all those things. So you can't devolve it from anything else and say, it's finance, this is the CFO, so that person must report there or whatever. But that's my personal opinion on that. But in best practice, I think it's to the highest level in the institution.
Yeah.
On the company secretary role,
Municipality.
Okay, thank you for the question. The Companies Act is very clear what is the role of the company secretary, and it talks about that the company secretary has to be responsible for the rules and the regulations of the country. So when you draw a policy from a legislation, which is the whistleblowing policy, is coming from the Protect Disclosure Act and is also from the Companies Act, it's best practice that the policy is managed by the company secretary. The role of internal audit is to ensure that there are controls in place to manage the policy, and that management adheres to the policy, and that any breaches to the policy then are reported to the board or to the audit committee. So if you talk about the 3 lines of defense, the role of the internal audit is very clear that it is a 3rd line of defense. The first line of defense is management. The second line of defense is the CRO, the compliance, the company secretary role that fits in there, as well as the fact that the internal audit plays a 3rd line of defense because it gives independent, objective assurance on the processes of the organization and the controls. So as soon as you want to be an internal auditor that presents a policy, then you get conflicted, because then first you must defend the policy with management, then you're going to have difficulty in managing the policy. Then thirdly, you're going to have a problem in ensuring that the policy is being implemented, because then you're struggling the roles, and therefore your role and responsibility becomes blurred, and therefore you're not going to become an effective internal auditor.
All right. For a municipality, who's the company secretary? Service delivery. Who is the company secretary at a municipality?
Get the AG response.
Or supposed to be?
I wanted to say outsource, but
Yeah. Hey, consultant, that's a good idea.
There is review on the consulting spend in the public sector, so let's wait for that. I think in a municipality, normally there are compliance officers, and they normally fulfill that function of company secretary. I know in some places they normally push it to the CFO or internal audit, but I think rightly what Tobeka has said about the role of the company secretary needs to be independent from those functions. They need to support your chairpersons of the various committees. So I think normally municipalities, they do have a compliance officer, and sometimes you'll see at these meetings, they challenge the CFOs and says, well, PFMS is this, but you haven't complied, or MFMS is this, you know, you've come short here. So I think in those municipalities, it is normally the compliance, and I think most municipalities should and do have a compliance officer because of the risks associated with complying with all the legislation in the public sector.
All right.
I think in
Do we have the mics in the right? Okay, when she finishes, please go on.
Okay.
with
I
your
think there is no right way of having a company secretary role in any organization. As long as you understand what that role entails and where that role needs to sit and what is the responsibility, then it will find its way in the reporting structure in an organization. There's a book by Bob Barak who talks about the fish rots from the head. So if you're a company secretary, you must know that the fish will rot from the head, and that's where it needs to be sitting, with the next to the CEO of any organization. Otherwise, then you're not going to have good governance in any organization, whether being a public sector or whether it's a private sector.
Thank you very much, Tobeka. I want to take, you can't now ask 2 or 3 questions. Just one. Please go ahead, sir.
I've, to the committee in front, I mean, I've posed this question to various forums, and I have not yet got a satisfying answer. And it relates to risk management. And the question I'm going to pose is, how do we get to know what we don't know? How best do we get a complete set of risks, considering that previous answers that I've got was we do self-assessments. I mean, risk is about uncertainties. How best do we get to know all of them?
All right. There's the last question here. I apologize if I can't see you. The lights are too bright. The last question here. Please go ahead, sir. And have an in-meeting about who answers that one in the meantime.
Hi, my name is Ashley. Just with regards to independent evaluation or committee evaluation, how often do you do it independently, and is it better practice to have it rotated amongst service providers, or are you comfortable to have one service provider provide evaluation for your board or individual directors, or as a collective as such?
All right, let's start with the last question. Was that one about knowing what we don't know?
I'm probably going to give you a response based on Woolworths. We have an independent evaluation every second year, and we often change a service provider because you want to make sure that the person is going to look at things differently. Because once you have the same service provider, you might find that they use the same format and the same approach and the same framework that they've used in the prior years. Whereas when you get a new independent evaluator, you get a different perspective. So it's often advisable to actually have an independent evaluator every second year. Then every year that you don't have one, then the company secretary does a high-level evaluation with the chairman of the board as well as with the chairman of each of the committee, so that you present those in the meetings, taking into consideration some of the issues that have been raised by the independent evaluator in those meetings. So it's always best practice to get an independent evaluator in to do the evaluation of the board and the subcommittees of the board.
All right.
We had a quick in-committee, and it was decided Brian will answer that question.
Yeah, Brian, I thought he was in a bad mood. He wants the CRO fired. He's not talking. I'm not talking.
Yeah, I think your question where you say, how do you get a complete list of all the risk, is probably a question where the entity should be asking themselves, how do I identify the top risks that actually impact on my business? Because getting a complete list is probably a holy grail. You'll never get there. Because risks are ever evolving. I mean, there's always new events that happen within the business, and there's always new risks emerging. So it's a moving target. So I think what's key is an entity at least identifying its key risks, those risks that have a high impact on the business, and those are the ones that you need to keep an eye on. And you also need to ensure that you've got a process in place to ensure that all those risks that are small and that are becoming big risks for your entity, you've got systems in place that actually identify data that's making that risk more significant for your entity. So I think you should look at risk assessment from your risk assessment process and your risk management process from that perspective, highlighting the top. I think that's why you see even in our simulation, our absent chief risk officer was supposed to just deal with the top 10 risks. We were not looking at the whole universe.
Oh, because the risk of thinking a risk is not a top 10, it's even a bigger risk, right? This is risk number 25. Oops. No, it's number 1.
Maybe
Karen?
I could just add something there, is that I'm just reflecting on our own risk committee, and we monitor the top 10 risks, but we also look at the emerging risks. Because every quarter as an executive team, you go through your risk register, you look at the economic environment, you look at legislation, and you look at your emerging risks. But it's a culture that must be there right through the organization, and it must be driven by the CRO.
All right. Oh,
I also have a comment. It's also good to look at the industry risks. If I sit on the petroleum industry, it's also to look at the risks that are available, that are affecting maybe a Shell, a Sasol, and so forth. If I'm sitting at an audit committee or board for Boeing, I need to understand what risks are faced by Emirates or Qatar and so forth, because the risk would cut across industries. Thank you.
all right.
I think just to sum up on the risk question, I think it's important to note we have management, internal audit, and external audit in most instances. And most of the time, they do their own risk assessments as well. But I think from an audit committee perspective, and even from a board perspective, when you accept those appointments, you need to have an understanding of that entity, its industry, its operating environment. So even going down to the detail to see, the printing, where is the risk? What if this machine breaks down? Is this a risk for the institution? So from that perspective, independently, you can say, oh wait, you guys didn't think if this printing machine breaks down, you won't sell any newspapers, there may be a big going concern. Where's your backup plan for that? So you can provide that. So you'll never always be able to cover all your risks. But I think from an independence point of view, outside of management, audit committees and boards can pick that up and question management, question internal audit, question external audit, and say, I've seen this happening in this industry, or I've seen yesterday something's happened at one of your plants, for instance. Where is this on the risk register? How have you mitigated that?
Mm-hmm. All right. She's Serena Mainkis from Discovery Holdings. She's compliant. That's why I stood behind her. She doesn't bother. She knows her story. Brian Mungofa got a CRO fired from Konki. Karen Pepler, she's from Sasria. Dumimi Dupe, she's from Inkebo Consulting. Tobega, Sishuba Masheho, she's from Woolworths. She's the company secretary who risks more than anybody else. Mohadi Machaba Abiodun from Ernst & Young. Ahmed, very quiet because IT doesn't make a lot of noise. Ahmed Pandol from Kongi and Jacques de Villiers from Kongi, the Alberton office. I think you should do like they do at the Opera House, they stand and they take a standing ovation, because I think they did very well. They deserve a round of applause.